Going beyond the headlines. Asking the questions you want answered. Exploring government policies and how they impact you. We are delving deeper.
Good evening and welcome to Delving Deeper. I'm your host, Kimberly D'Souza. Joining us this evening is the Minister of National Security, the Honorable Fitzgerald Hinds. Minister Hinds, good evening.
A very good evening to you.
How are you? Thank you so much for joining us.
The pleasure is mine. Happy to be in your company and that of your viewers.
And I know they're going to be happy as well. Minister, I want to jump right in. I want to tackle crime, which is a very critical issue right now in Trinidad and Tobago. I know that you would have served as the minister in the Ministry of National Security from 2002 to 2007. How did the approach to crime change from then to now?
Well, the issues at that time was, yes, general murders and robberies and that sort of thing. But the real alarm at that time was kidnapping for ransom. That took up a lot of our attention. Today, that is no longer a major feature on the landscape because things were done and approaches were taken, and we were able to demonstrate to the criminal element who were engaged in the crime of kidnapping for ransom that we were not prepared to negotiate with them. And once we found a cooperative victim and the family, we were able to do that. We passed and improved certain laws, and we used all the resources we had to get straight at it and at them. And interestingly enough, we saw a reduction in the figure from 51 in 1 year down to 3 by the next year. And as I speak to you today, it is not a major feature on the landscape of Trinidad and Tobago. At that time as well, guns were in the society, but certainly not at the level and at the rate at which they are present now, particularly assault weapons, which usually are in the hands of military personnel in combat. Now they are on every street corner around Trinidad and Tobago. That too has changed substantially. In addition to that, the criminal cohort in the society has shifted gear a bit. He's a smarter, more educated, more tech-savvy operator today, and therefore a lot has changed. A lot has changed in the society, and in response to crime as a result. So the platform is a lot different.
Well, let's look at some of those changes. What sort of policies have been implemented now to deal with crime?
Well, insofar as policies are concerned, the government's main focus, given the fact that Trinidad and Tobago is a twin island state with many bays and many inlets all around us, and we are so close to the mainland, Venezuela, 25-minute speedboat travel away from here, we have focused substantially on the question of border security for obvious reasons. The other imperative in terms of policy is the question of firearm retrieval, because as I indicated to you a while ago, a major issue is the prevalence and the wanton use of firearms in the society. So that is another major plank. We have had a legislative agenda, a very robust one over the last few years, where we improved elements of the law and the platform to the extent that we could in the fight against crime. In many, many ways, we improved the criminal justice system, and all in an attempt to tackle the crime problem more efficiently. So the government's policy has been that, and at the back end, insofar as the prison is concerned, when persons are convicted and find themselves in the prison, a major plank of the government's policy is the question of restorative justice, reintegration, rehabilitation of offenders so that you will avoid the revolving door syndrome. as we understood it. So those are the main planks of the government's policy in dealing with this question of crime. And as you know, the 17th and the 18th of this month, April, we will engage the national community, the region, and from a technological standpoint, even the world, in a discussion in Trinidad and Tobago about possible new approaches to dealing with crime. Because notwithstanding all that we have been doing for decades in this country, responding to crime and criminality, there seemed to be the need for more other ideas, other thoughts. And one of the approaches that we will be looking at is viewing crime as a public health concern. The Prime Minister initiated this. We had first planned a local symposium on the matter, and of course it appeared to be attractive to the other leaders in the region, and now it has morphed into a regional symposium, out of which we hope perhaps new thoughts, new ideas, new approaches should come in dealing with crime as a whole of government, whole of society issue, rather than traditionally looking at it purely from the standpoint of law enforcement and laws to respond to crime.
Now, Minister, in addition to the symposium, you mentioned things like restorative justice, gun retrieval, border patrols, and those are good. But how does the ministry know they are working? How are you able to tell if these and other policy are actually yielding results?
Well, they are yielding results because, I mean, we interdict firearms coming into our ports on a daily basis. As you know, guns are manufactured on a daily basis and distributed and sold and moved internationally from the major gun manufacturers in the world, not the least the United States, not very far from here. But from the time they cross our borders and get into our space, they are, for all intents and purposes, illegal. We have a Firearms Act that governs firearms in Trinidad and Tobago. And unless you are authorized to bear one by virtue of your work, like a police officer, a soldier, and that sort of thing, or otherwise allowed a license to carry one, it would be illegal in Trinidad and Tobago. We practice a restrictive policy in that regard. So we interdict many firearms, and of course it is a common sense position that every weapon seized by the police, taken out of the hands of criminals, and every bullet, every one of them, of course, represents possibly the saving of another life. And therefore, we know that interdiction, gun retrieval, border security, and those policy positions implemented by law enforcement are absolutely necessary.
Minister, I want to switch gears a bit to another issue that is very topical in our society, and that is marijuana, right? In years gone by, we've seen hundreds of citizens, particularly young men, who were arrested for possession of marijuana. Many of these cases are before the courts. But we do have the passage of the Cannabis Control Bill 2020, which I believe allows 30 grams. With the passage of that bill, are we seeing a reduction in the number of those cases that are before the courts?
Actually, the legislation came in two parts. One, to decriminalize small amounts, up to 60 grams of marijuana. And of course, on the other hand, to regulate the cannabis industry, which is growing in the world and which is Trinidad and Tobago is expected to play a part for medicinal and other such use. So yes, thousands of cases have now been redirected from the usual court lists. These contributed significantly to the delays in the criminal justice system. A person would have been arrested. Typically, the police will, largely on weekends, mount serious exercises all around the country. And it is not uncommon, it was not uncommon to see hundreds of persons coming into the courts on a Monday morning. You don't see that anymore, because the law is now that they can have in their possession up to 60 grams without it being a criminal offense, an arrestable offense. Up to 30 grams, there's no criminality, no sanction, but beyond 30 and up to 60, it is a ticketable offense. And we have observed that that has substantially reduced the number of persons who are arrested. That has saved a lot of police time, a lot of activity. And we thought it has gone very, very, very well in that regard. In fact, I must tell you, I can't recall, and in fact, from the reports that I have, you don't even see too many people on the streets. You know, I don't smell marijuana around the place as much as I used to, because people are not permitted to use it on the streets, though you can have it in your possession. And it has gone very well, and it has improved the criminal justice process in a significant way by reducing the number of criminal cases, that is to say, for 1 gram, 2 grams, up to 30 grams of marijuana. And it has made a big impact and improvement in that regard.
Right. But Minister, on the flip side, the bail amendment bill, I know that the government wasn't able to garner the support to get that bill passed. And one of the things is that a lot of people think is very critical. I know, for example, the former commissioner of police, he was gung-ho for it. He said it's going to be something that could also change the justice system. Are we seeing another attempt by the government to get new legislation as it relates to that drafted or passed anytime soon?
Well, let it be known that that particular bail amendment bill, or it was an act of parliament of which you speak, that was designed to and accompanied the anti-gang law. So we said, having created the parliament that is the anti-gang law, we said once you were charged for an offense under the anti-gang law, the bail amendment of which you speak would have restricted your bail for up to 120 days before you can make an application for same. That came to life in 2011, and it ran for 5 years. It came up for review in 2016, by which time we were in the government, and the past government that had the benefit of the restrictions on bail in the context of that which I just shared with you, they refused to lend support. So the bill lapsed, the law lapsed, and therefore the bail restrictions had now gone. We made a second attempt. We went back to the parliament with it based on the calls from the police service and the expectations of the larger society that is Trinidad and Tobago. And again, we were rebuffed by the opposition, and it remains the case that that law is no longer in place. Up to yesterday, I had a meeting with senior police officers, and the question of bail, as it regularly does, arose. The police officers expressed exasperation, frustration, and gave me countless examples of cases. One case in particular, where they arrested a man for firearms and ammunition, a known and repeat offender. And he was given bail in the police station by a justice of the peace. And by later the evening, that man was back on the streets, no doubt, to continue his criminal activity. That has a very debilitating, demoralizing, and frustrating impact on the police. And it is in those circumstances that the then commissioner would have raised that issue, because certainly some of the offenses under the anti-gang law, and that was the justification for it in the first place, required deeper and deeper investigations to show the connections between the persons who formed the gang. You have to present evidence to the court. And therefore, it was very disadvantageous to the police, and that's the reason for their call in that regard. Another issue that came up yesterday was the question of sentencing. We discussed earlier today how dangerous that lethal barreled thing that we call a gun has been. It cost us 87% of the 605 murders that Trinidad and Tobago experienced rather traumatically last year. 87% of those had to do with firearms. So it is self-evident that firearms play a very critical role in this bloody, murderous, traumatic experience that we are having. And the police are reporting to me up to yesterday that they would take great time, diligence, professionalism, conduct intelligence operations, pay attention to some persons for months on end. And when they finally nab him with a gun, present him to the court. In one case, he pleaded guilty. the court fined him $2,500, which, as the police understand, is even less than the value, the cost of the weapon itself.
So, Minister, the
And
examples that
therefore,
you're giving,
yeah.
it seems as if we need this piece of legislation. So are we going to see a revision of it or something new coming to be tabled?
Well, the government has indicated its intention to go back to the parliament, which is the only place where this could become manifest.
Right.
And on behalf of you, the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, placate the opposition to support that. In addition to that, the police have asked me to communicate with the powers that be, particularly the judiciary. Of course, the conduit to the judiciary from the cabinet is through the Attorney General, and therefore I intend to raise these concerns with the Attorney General so that he can raise them with the elements of the judiciary, where the police are concerned not only about the absence of the Bail Amendment Act, of which you have just spoken, but generally the grant of bail, which is the right of the court, which is within the purview of the court exclusively. We all understand that. But the police find that, repeat offenders are getting a chance to repeat because of the liberal grant of bail for very serious offenses. And of course, at the end of the trial process, the very menial sentences that are sometimes imposed, and therefore the deterrent effect is lost, and the crime and criminality, therefore, to that extent, continues.
Minister, the Ministry of National Security, they are allocated billions of dollars annually. I know that a significant portion of this goes towards purchasing tools and equipment to fight crime. How do you respond to the law enforcement agencies who are saying that the resources may not be sufficient?
Well, I would tell you, and I think it would be a benefit to the citizens of the country to understand, when you see, for example, a $5 billion allocation to the Ministry of National Security, I can tell you that about 65 or 66% of that goes towards salaries and emoluments. So it is not all of that $5 billion. So you are quite right in saying some of it. And of course, in terms of whether they have sufficient resources or equipment, whichever they force, as minister, the government relies on requests for such equipment from these organizations. And once they are presented and it gets approval by the cabinet and the procurement process is undertaken, resources are provided, whether it is vehicles, whether it is firearms, whether it is uniforms, whether it is whatever it is. So this is an ongoing process, and I suspect that you will probably never have all that you want. But I am able to tell you today, based on my conversation with the Commissioner of Police, not the current commissioner, but the previous commissioners, I specifically asked both of them whether they could truthfully say that the police service was without the resources that it needed. And while they both commonsensically concede that there will always be an opportunity for more, it is not that they do not have resources enough to respond professionally as they're expected to do and to face off this crime surge and crime problem that we are confronted with in Trinidad and Tobago. So as minister, I'm able to tell you there will always be a need for more resources, much like in our own personal circumstances and lives. But it is not the case that they do not have resources enough to carry out this work. But it's an ongoing process, and as resources are requested, we, the government, react as promptly as we can to finance it as best as the country can afford.
Yeah. Minister, you mentioned uniforms, and I think it was key that you mentioned that, because I wanted to know what message you have for the police officers who bring the service into disrepute.
There are any number of ways in which a person who is not a police officer or a soldier can come into possession of an item of uniform, or perhaps even a complete uniform. So an investigation is always necessary. And it would be difficult for me to comment in the generality on it, as though in all cases where criminals have uniforms, it is police officers who handed it to them. But in particular, when you are speaking about police officers who would criminally or recklessly make items of police uniform and insignia available to criminals, that clearly is a criminal offense like any other. And I have seen as a former police officer myself, the police service investigate crimes committed by police officers. And police officers in this country have been charged for every single offense, from obscene language to murder, to possession of firearms, possession of narcotics. And that is to be encouraged. So I say to them, in answer to your specific question, those who are inclined to behave in those ways, cease and desist. And those who are not and are sworn to protect us from the outcomes of that kind of conduct should do it very robustly and bring them to justice. And the policy of the government, clearly stated by me and by the leader of this government, the Honorable Prime Minister, to the leaders of those organizations, has been and remains, if anyone among you demonstrates unfitness for the high office, the noble profession of policing or soldiering and such like, your business is to apply the law, follow the law, and get them out. Because we know that they are a danger to the people of Trinidad and Tobago.
But we've also been seeing where, at the end of a crime scene, when police go on the scene to do the investigation, there has been ammunition that has been traced back to people from the protective services. I mean, how do you also respond to that?
The police investigators have found shells of ammunition stamped TTPS and TTDF. And there are any number of ways in which this could have been used in a crime scene. And therefore, an investigation is required in each and every case. But it is a very troubling situation for the public. It is a very troubling situation for the government. And it is a very troubling situation for yours truly as Minister of National Security. And I can tell you, based on my deliberations with them, the heads of these organizations. Hence the reason why they have all, since that kind of development, they have all taken action to reinforce and to ring fence the way they manage the distribution and the use of ammunition within the respective forces. They have done that. And of course, investigations will continue in each particular case to see precisely where that would have come from. Take it from me, there are all kinds of possibilities.
In addition to the work done by the law enforcement agencies, what can we do as average citizens to ensure that we are safe? And additionally, how can parents keep their children safe as well?
Well, I think it is self-evident that the first law enforcement person, if I can put that in parentheses, would be the parent. Parents have a very, very critical and a clear role to play in the guidance, the nurturing, the development of the child, to protect that child, which doesn't understand the implications of some of its possible actions and its circumstances. Children don't understand the extent of the danger that might be in any particular situation. And it is the duty of parents, and beyond that, adults in the various communities and teachers where they are in school, to guide and to protect our children. And we all have a responsibility, a God-given responsibility, to protect our children from harm and from danger and from exposure and abuse. Insofar as the other issue you raise,
adults, how can we also keep ourselves
adults,
safe? Yeah.
It is sensible to me, and it is quite obvious, if anywhere in the world you go, if you veer off the beaten track, like you take yourself to the sleazy parts of the particular city that you go to, and that exists in every city, everywhere in the world, then you raise the potential and the exposure to harm and danger for yourself. And therefore, you have a duty as an individual to exercise care, to exercise good sense, to watch where you walk, watch what you do, protect your personal belongings, protect your home as best as you can. You have the first responsibility in that regard, and that does not take away from the responsibility of the society through the police and law enforcement and other security measures to protect you. But certainly you do have some responsibility in this for yourself, and once you exercise that, I think both taken together should put us on firm ground.
Yeah. Now, Minister, I understand that Dr. Randy Sipasad from UWI, he would have done some work at the ministry regarding crime prevention versus crime suppression. What is the driving force of criminality in TNT?
His main thesis, and I was present when he delivered elements of it, quite apart from the fact that I've had interpersonal contact with him on these matters, his view is that as a society, we spend a lot of our resources on crime suppression. And he is of the view that more should be spent on crime prevention. As we go into this symposium on crime as a public health concern, I can see some validity in what he is saying. In fact, we do spend a lot of resources on crime prevention. In my view, the seamless education system that your society, our society has put in place for children in early childhood through primary school, seamlessly into secondary school, and to facilitate them who need it at the tertiary level. And we have many, 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 many examples of persons who benefited from that seamless situation, education platform. I think that is society's spending on crime prevention, because it develops the individual to the point where he could become a contributory and competitive individual to himself, to his family, and of course to the society. We have a housing program where we spend a large amount of tax-paying dollars to develop houses and to make them available to people at very small rents, at less than market rates, even in the mortgage context, so as to create stability in families and therefore communities. We have a health system that affords persons at no direct expense to them medical care at the primary level and even at the tertiary level as well. We have, as I told you, a restorative justice philosophy which we operate in the prisons, and there are many, many programs that prisoners, even those on remand, have an opportunity to participate in to rebuild their lives so that they can properly reintegrate into the society once they come out of the penal system, and I have seen that at work. So I am saying that a substantial amount of resources, the Ministry of Social Development, that spends about $7 billion per year, and a large chunk of that is spent on relief to persons who need it, whether it is senior citizens grant, whether it is for medical support, for glasses, for books, for meals, all kinds of support to pay rents, and all kinds of support out of the Ministry of Social Development so as to not cause people to feel that they are so on the edge that they have to hurt someone else in order to get it. But aside from all of that, for some, crime is a business. For some, it is a choice to live a life and to benefit from a life of crime. For them, it's a business model, as I said on one occasion recently. And for them, it is about opportunity. So the more buoyant the economy looks, the more active they become. So it is not always about poverty or need. Sometimes it's greed. Sometimes it's raw selfishness. Sometimes it's adventurism. I am no criminologist, so I wouldn't want to venture us to the causes of crime. But I think as a layperson, you and I would agree, all of these are influences in this very complex issue of why human beings choose to do wrong rather than to do right, to cheat in an attempt to win. When David Rudder say you don't have to cheat to be a winner, and you don't have to steal to get enough, especially in Trinidad and Tobago, where things are challenging but not near as bad as to warrant that, because there are opportunities for every one of us. And there are examples of those of us, many examples, who have made use of those opportunities and have not found it necessary to embark on a life of crime as a business or for any other reason. A youngster told me recently that there's a particular video game which teaches how to rob, how to scheme and rob. He told me that. So it is against that backdrop that I express the view that I am certain that the violence that they learn, the disrespect for the human body that they learn, particularly women and children, the movies and those kinds of things that teach violence and teach individualism and selfishness and teach, as the youngster told me, how to rob, these things do influence some persons. There are a lot of gangster movies that actually inspire some weak young people to want to be like that. I mean, you just see some of that. You see when many artists are performing, you see various mannerisms that are consistent among them all. It is learned behavior. So I was of that view and I expressed it. But of course, it is not the only element. There are many and varied reasons why people get involved in lives of crime.
Yeah. Minister, let's look at the whole of government approach. I know usually with ministries, they often like to partner with other ministries, state agencies, in order to get the assistance that they need. Can you name a few that the Ministry of National Security may be partnering with other ministries, other state agencies in this fight against crime?
The Ministry of Youth Development and National Service, which attends to a population of about 498,000 persons between the ages of 10 and 35. And it is interestingly enough between those ages that you see many of the persons who get involved, young people who get involved in crime. So that ministry is a ministry we work very closely with. As a matter of fact, the MILAT and the MIPA, the military-led youth programs that we had in national security, they have now been transposed to the Ministry of Youth Development. That alone should demonstrate to you, along with the fact that we have now established a standalone youth ministry, how we understand the importance of attending to the youth as a cohort of the larger society. So that is a ministry that I relate to very regularly in the course of my work. The Ministry of Education, as I indicated to you a while ago, a well-learned, well-balanced, confident, self-esteemed person coming out of school, feeling confident, coming out of university, ready for the place of work, that individual is less likely to be a burden to us in the context of criminality. The Ministry of Social Development, I alluded to that a while ago. All of the ministries of government, community development does a lot of programs, sport, any one of the ministries and all of the programs they convey. It's really a whole of government approach. And that is precisely what this symposium is aiming at. The need for us to understand that it is not simply about the police and law enforcement in responding to crime, but the preventative, the nurturing, the caring, the supportive, like GATE and all those wonderful programs are what are necessary. In the context of GATE, it is to ensure that no child is denied an opportunity to maximize its potential because its parents or those responsible for that person didn't have the financial means. Yeah. And that basically is the common thread in all of this. No, but at the back end, when all of that didn't bite and the individual falls victim to a life of criminality, comes into the system, he's dealt with in accordance with the law to protect the society from that conduct. And of course, if he finds himself, even in the court system, there are ways the court has probation, community service, different ways even the courts apply to protect an individual and to guide him on the right path. But if all of that fails, it is serious enough and he finds himself in the prison, we have all of these programs inside of the prison and they benefit from it as well. And I have seen many persons who would have benefited from those programs, would have left the prison and have gone on a straight and narrow path henceforth.
Minister, let's also change gears and address technology. I know that a lot of ministries have been using technology in their approach to how they operate. How is the Ministry of National Security doing that as well, in terms of using digital transformation technology in how they manage or deal with crime?
Well, technology is being used across the board in all aspects of law enforcement. We have, from our national coastal radar system to the body cameras to electronic filing of cases in the courts today, virtual court appearances in the prison, IT, the application of IT across the board. So yes, information technology is at work, and as that and those techniques improve, we are improving their use and application across the law enforcement and across national security to great and positive effect.
Now, Minister, as we mentioned earlier, you are no stranger to the Ministry of National Security portfolio. And I wanted you to share some successes. You were minister in the ministry, but now you are the minister. What has been some of your, or have been some of your successes thus far since being the Minister of National Security?
Well, when I was in the Ministry of National Security earlier, I had the responsibility largely for the prison. We would have introduced the whole policy on restorative justice. As Minister of National Security, my job largely involves solving problems. There are many problems in Trinidad and Tobago that afflict us, that affect our smooth and efficient operations. So a large part of my job is about solving problems. One of my greatest achievements in my own view so far has been the virtual transformation of the Forensic Science Center. When I went to the Forensic Science Center 2 years ago, the DNA system was not functioning. We were sending DNA samples abroad. I had a conversation with the element of the judiciary, and the judiciary pointed out that the paucity of service from the Forensic Science Center was affecting the criminal justice process. By way of an example, when a person was charged for possession of a firearm, it had to be certified for evidential purposes as a lethal barreled weapon, something capable of discharging a projectile. That would have taken 2 and 3 years. Meanwhile, the matter is being adjourned and adjourned and adjourned in the court. And I took the position that that is untenable. So I set about, in collaboration with the leadership at the Forensic Science Center, to get to work. So we have. And today, we can now produce these reports in a matter of 2 and 3 days. Similarly, in terms of ballistics, we have, when I was in the Ministry of National Security, we purchased the IBIS, or the ballistic processing and storing equipment. It was used, but it, in our view, was not used optimally. Within recent times, we have now sought and we are now enjoying optimal use of it. And I could tell you, while the police are investigating a crime now, and they have the suspect in custody, they may have seized a weapon in some robbery or some crime, they are now able to get from the Forensic Science Center a report on that firearm, which might demonstrate that it was used in other crime scenes months or even years ago. And that kind of, because we say every firearm tells a story, and that kind of technical improvement is assisting the police in a significant way in dealing with crimes. One of the other things that we implemented, and when I say we, I'm talking about law enforcement, because I am the minister, but of course we have the police service, we have the defense force, and it is their leadership under the guidance of the government's policy that really is to be implemented. But we have seen, you would have seen on this weekend, there were 3 home invasions. And on each of those occasions, the police were able to confront the bandits fleeing the scene of their crime bode very, very positively for me, because it demonstrates that the way the police has now laid out some of its resources, particularly the direct, targeted, active patrols which we put in place, they are now able to intercept and to confront these criminals a lot more efficiently than previously. And on each of these 3 occasions, they were able to confront them. They arrested all, I suspect, or the main players, those who were in the car or on the scene. They arrested them. And of course, unfortunately, some of the occupants of those vehicles, the criminals, are reported to have fired on the police, and the police, in the execution of their duty, exercising the use of force policy that they are trained to observe, returned fire, and very sadly, we lost 3 young lives in our country. But I would like to see that response on the part of the police continue, among, of course, other things. Yeah. So we have seen substantial improvement in the way in which the DNA section in the Forensic Center, as a matter of fact, we have now improved the number of persons substantially in the last year whose samples have now been taken to put on our DNA database, because we do have a DNA database. And when you see those officers in white on a crime scene, they are taking crime stains and samples from crime scenes which are stored. So sometime they're going to meet a person whose sample is also stored, and there will be a match. That's the way the thing works. We have improved quietly the numbers of persons, because the law, the DNA law, says who should provide samples. And to the extent that we could, we have insisted on this, and this is happening as I speak to you.
No, Minister,
so the police are now reporting to me, particularly the Homicide Bureau of the Police Service, that they, between CERU, which is an internal analytical unit of the police service, and the Forensic Science Center, they are making great progress. You would have seen we established a cold case unit where some experience of retired police officers, along with serving police officers, would have come together and would have paid close attention to some matters, murder matters that would have been unsolved. And they began to revisit some of these cases. And last year, the police solve rate improved, and a number of the cases for which they would have charged, you would have seen a prison officer charged recently. He was not a prison officer when the murder took place, but he entered the prison service and he was recently charged for that murder. It didn't stop there for me, because the question was for me, how did he get into the prison service while he may have been a suspect? So I told you my job involves problem solving. So I went into that with the prison service to look at the way they vet in their recruitment of personnel. I did the same for the Defense Force. And we are working to improving those. A lot that we do in national security cannot be seen by the public, cannot be spoken of. Just take it from me. We have many problems here, and it is about solving them, because my view is, as we solve these problems, we have porous borders. What did we do? We got the cabinet's approval, and we spent millions of dollars to purchase new maritime assets. And having put those in the water, I received intelligence reports, and from the reports available to me, this week alone, I had 3 reports coming to me about successful interdictions using the coastal radar systems and identifying contacts of interest, as they call it, zeroed in on them, and we were able to interdict them from bringing illegal things into the country. And therefore, this is the kind of thing we are talking about. We are improving. You would have heard me say that the police are like in the gym putting on muscle. They needed to improve their investigative capacity, a tremendous amount of training and further upskilling and professionalization of police is being undertaken as we speak. I visit regularly the Police Training Academy and I see what they are doing. I encourage what they are doing. I provide the resources to ensure that they continue. All, as I say in metaphor, building muscle so that the police service will become far more proficient in responding to the burgeoning crime problems that affront Trinidad and Tobago.
Now, Minister, last year the Prime Minister would have announced plans to declare violent crime as a public health emergency. We're going to be having a symposium tomorrow that is going to address these issues. What are the expected outcomes from this symposium?
Yes, it would be the issues of parenting, issues of mental health, issues of social service provision by various governments of the region, preventative measures. We're going to be hearing from the intellectuals coming out of the university. We're going to be hearing from practitioners in the field like the Children's Authority and that sort of thing. We'll be hearing from the police commissioners in the region. Commissioner Christopher would be making a presentation, other commissioners from the region, other ministers of security from the region. I too would be making a short presentation. And it is all in recognition of the fact that the thing possibly needs to go beyond police and law enforcement, as I said earlier. When we dealt with COVID-19, we saw where measures had to be imposed, whether it was wearing masks, whether we couldn't shake each other's hands, we couldn't kiss our friends and embrace people, we stayed away from groupings and that sort of thing. We were all willing, as we were fighting that unseen and deadly enemy, to make personal sacrifices. The state imposed a state of emergency. Laws were passed. How many people should be in a grouping? How many not? Who should be at a workplace or where? Those things we were able to give up. We were able to, willing to sacrifice in our collective response to the threat of COVID-19. And we still lost over 4,000 lives. So at the rate at which we're losing lives to violence, whether it's in the home, domestic violence, whether it is because of a fire, whatever it is. Recently, we had a fire that created a lot of trauma for me, for the fire service, and for all of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and questions of resources came. And, you know, we had to explain to the national community that we have been providing resources. It's an ongoing basis and we continue to do that. So altogether, in the context of the symposium tomorrow and Tuesday, it is to sensitize the national community and, very importantly, to get ideas from a wide cross-section of the society. There will be an online platform available to the public, local, regional, and international, for a couple days before the symposium, and as well a couple days after, to give all who are interested an opportunity to have their voices be heard. From that, we will glean the best ideas, and the group of leaders in the Caribbean will come up with a joint statement which will shape the policy positions for perhaps each of us going forward in our response to the burgeoning question of crime in the region. Because, as you know, whether it is St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenada, Jamaica, the Bahamas, we are all seriously affected by it. We share common problems, as we did with COVID-19, and therefore we feel a regional response will certainly be of value to all of us.
Minister Hinds, thank you so much for joining us this evening. You sat in a hot seat and I think you handled it well, so thank you so much.
I thank you very, very much. The pleasure was all mine. Thank you.
Join us at the same time next week for another edition of Delving Deeper. I am Kimberly D'Souza, and on behalf of our entire crew, have a good night.